today's discussion. So we're going to be talking about the role of government in the economy. And as you might have heard, you might know from last year, specifically the IBT students, you guys engaged quite a lot about theories and policy and theories and evolution of economic systems. But generally, there are three main schools of thought around what a government should and should not be doing. The first is a school of thought that is called free market capitalism. Then we are also going to talk briefly about Marxist-Leninist approach to government intervention. And finally, a Keynesianist or institutionalist approach to how the government should be, what they should and shouldn't do in the economy. Okay, so let's start with the idea of free market capitalism. So as you guys might know, Adam Smith developed free capital or the idea of capitalism as a sort of contrast to the feudal system. Can anyone please tell me what is the feudal system, or what is a feudal system in a few sentences? You're welcome to unmute yourself or type it out in the chat, whatever you prefer.
Let me try.
Yes, thanks, Gugu.
Feudalism was like a system which was used like in Europe back in the day, where classism was like the main factor, where if you're from the nobility, if you're a peasant, or you are, what's the name of the word? You are like in the middle class. So basically it was the nobility which used to control the economy, or the people who are wealthier, I think.
Yep, excellent. Okay, very good point. That's very well described. Thank you very much. So it is a system that was not just in Europe, but also in parts of West Africa and Asia as well. And very much it was the nobility that controlled all of the factors of production. So when we talk in economics about the factors of production, we mean the things that help you produce goods. So one of the most important factors of production is land. And another factor of production is labor. And so in a feudal society, it was the nobility that controlled both land and, to some extent, labor. In some parts, slavery was very common. In other parts, a system that is called serfdom was used, where people would basically be slaves, but they would be technically free to go wherever they want. But in reality, they didn't have enough money or resources, or really the decision to leave their land and just go elsewhere. They were farming on the land that was owned by a certain lord, and that lord would provide in their needs and make sure they have enough to live off the land. Okay. So what Adam Smith basically said is that there came this, what naturally sort of evolved in Europe and in these places that were feudal, is what later came to be called capitalism. And so what Adam Smith basically said is that there is a sort of self-interest that happens naturally, right? Where people, when they are able to produce excess things, they will want to exploit those around them. They will want to self-maximize their interest. Self-maximization means I want as much as possible for myself, okay? And the only way to do that is to take from other people, right? What Adam Smith said is that this actually happens in a mutually beneficial sort of relationship. And what this practically means is that if we want people to have meat and bread, it's not very efficient for the Lord to go and tell everyone how much meat and how much bread they should have. Instead, what he proposed is that the government just does nothing. The government just steps back and stops trying to allocate resources, trying to give people how much they should or shouldn't have. He said people will naturally self-maximize, and as a result, everyone will have as much bread and as much meat in an economy as they need. Okay, and how this practically works is that, let's say, for example, Gugu is a butcher, and she cuts up pieces of meat. Belize, on the other hand, is a baker, and so she bakes bread. Gugu is trying to exploit Belize by charging as high a possible price for her meat as she can possibly get. Belize then goes and buys this meat from Gugu. And because she's buying the meat, she is actually being exploited to some extent by Gugu, because Gugu charges a very high price for her meat, as high as she can possibly get. On the other hand, Belize then goes and makes bread. And so she takes these pieces of bread and tries to charge as high a possible price for the bread as she can. Gugu goes and buys the bread, and Gugu in turn is exploited by Belize. And so both of them think, I got the better of Gugu and Belize. I got the better of the other person because I exploited them. I was able to make a good profit from them. But in the end of the day, both of them are actually being exploited, so that none of them are being exploited. And so in that way, supply and demand of bread and meat kind of equalize out in the economy. And as a result, we don't need to tell Gugu how much meat she should have or how much bread Belize should have, but we just leave everything alone, and market forces will automatically sort out this allocation problem, okay? And this is generally, sometimes people talk about what is called the invisible hand. So Adam Smith first coined the term of the invisible hand of supply and demand, basically saying that there is an invisible force of supply and demand which makes sure that everyone in the economy has enough. And if someone has too much, the forces of supply and demand will eventually cause them to get rid of too much, because more people will because if Gugu's price for meat is too high, no one will take that meat, no one will buy the meat, and so Gugu will be forced to reduce the price of her meat so that enough people are able to get Gugu's meat. Okay, so basically free market capitalism is built upon the idea that the forces of supply and demand will naturally solve all of our problems in the economy, and that if we try to intervene as a government, we will just inevitably screw things up. If we try to make sure that Gugu gets enough meat by maybe giving Gugu some meat, then the person that is selling meat will no longer be able to sell meat. And so that person will then go bankrupt because no one is buying her meat because people are getting meat for free, right? And so as a result, it doesn't really help us trying to interfere in this market and to try to give people meat, because meat producers will naturally produce meat at the right price. Okay. Any questions about anything I've said thus far about free market capitalism? Peter says, but not all people are involved in the production. There are some who are only consumers. Very excellent point, Peter. So this is actually a very big critique against free market capitalism. At the time when Adam Smith was writing about this, unemployment was not a thing. People were not really unemployed because most people were working on subsistence farms, either for the lords, or they were working in small businesses in the cities. So unemployment was not really a thing. And poverty, even though it did exist, people thought poverty existed because you were disobedient to God. And so people did not really understand poverty in a very meaningful way. And so in many ways, free market capitalism depends on the assumption that everybody is involved in production. Everyone is in some way, shape, or form included in the economy, right? And the reality is that people aren't. There's a big amount of people that are unemployed, that are below the poverty line, and that really cannot contribute towards the production of an economy. Yep. So that's a very good point. Peter, what do you think is the implications of not all people being involved in the production?
I think they are taken advantage of, because there's no way like they are going to benefit from those who are taking advantage of them. Like what you said, if I had something I was producing, I was going also to charge more as what you charged me. But if I don't have something that I'm producing, you know.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in the original theory, Adam Smith assumed that everyone at the very least has their labor. So if you have nothing else, you at least have your labor. And so you can always exploit someone with your labor. You can always charge more for your labor. And so a laborer can exploit his boss by charging more for his labor. But the reality is, like Peter said, sometimes laborers don't have the ability to sell their labor. There's not a job for them. And also, it doesn't really consider the power imbalances between an employer and an employee. And most of the time, it's not the employee that exploits the employer with their labor, it is the other way around. Yeah, so that is a very big problem with this idea. Polani says, do we have fully free market capitalist economies? Because the government has always intervened, more especially during difficult times in the economy, though different means like stimulus packages, tax benefits, and bailouts. Yeah, very good point. So free market capitalism doesn't exist. It probably hasn't ever existed. And I doubt that it ever will. There has never been a free market. Yes, Eche, you are perfectly right. We have some economies that have come very close to free market form of capitalism, but pure free market capitalism hasn't existed yet, or maybe it has in the very far past, but it doesn't exist today. Yeah, so that is, it is more a theory and an idea instead of that we are working towards, instead of something that we actually see in practicality. Okay. Okay, Illis says another consequence to this idea is errors in measurement of GDP. Please expand. I'm not sure.
So if you're including everybody as laborers in the economy, then you're assuming that the government is paying all those people when they're not necessarily working, and maybe they're consuming more because now they depend on the people who work and they consume more. So yeah, I think that the GDP can be inflated or the opposite depending on that assumption.
Yep, definitely. Yeah, if someone is not employed, it can really cause GDP to be misrepresentative of the actual activity within an economy. Okay, very good point. Eche says the barter system is the closest to free market, or was. It might have been in some economies. In many places where the barter system was in place, the feudal system was also in place. And so if feudalism exists, the factors of production are not owned by individuals, but by classes. And in that sense, it isn't really capitalism either. So yeah, it's an interesting point, but maybe in some instances, in some places where the barter system existed very long ago, maybe capitalism existed as well. Okay, so what capitalism is built upon is the idea that everyone has access to the factors of production, most importantly, capital and labor, right? And so with capital, I'm not sure the IBT students might be very familiar with the concept of capitalism within economics, but in case you are not familiar or you maybe forgot, capital refers to basically the things that you are able to get with money, things that build over time, things like land, things like equipment, like cash flow, all of those things are considered capital. And so when we talk about capitalism, it is a system that is built upon the idea that everyone has free and open access to factors of production. The truth is that we are very close to it. We are much closer to it than, for example, under the feudal system where land was thoroughly owned by a certain class of government. and labor in many ways was also owned by that class. Under capitalism, theoretically, most of us have the ability to offer our labor to any institution. Whether they want our labor or not, that is up to the vagaries of capitalism. But in theory, we have the ability to work for any place we have. And we are also able to produce anything we want, technically, under capitalism. And so that doesn't mean we can, it just means that we have the right to do that. And so those are really good things about this theory of free market capitalism that has kind of spread throughout the world, because people have seen the benefit of not hoarding the capital, the factors of production. It's not very efficient for the government to own all of the land, as is the case under the feudal system, because what happens then is productivity is quite low because the government is not very good at allocating scarce resources. We see that the market is much better at doing that. Okay, so free market capitalism was really a much better improvement on the feudal system, certainly. But there were some problems with it, which is some of the things that you guys have identified. Now, when we get to one of the biggest critiques against free market capitalism, there was a time period in the early 1800s, in the late 1800s, where some scholars were criticizing capitalist accumulation and the capitalist system. And in particular, we have the thinkers of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and they were alive during the European Industrial Revolution and the end of monarchy, right? So at that time when they were alive, most of the countries were changing from a monarch, a king or a queen ruling that country, to something that is more republican or more democratic, right? And so it was a very turbulent time in Europe's history, and that's where these thinkers were located in terms of history, right? And what they said, like you guys said, is that capitalism is inherently unequal because some people, like Peter said, don't have jobs, don't have the ability to produce their labor, and they would always be discounted from the system. They will not be part of the system. What they also talked about is how capital seems to accumulate, whereas labor does not accumulate. So basically, people with money get more money, and that money grows over time. But and they give that money to their children and to their children's children and their children's children's children. And so people are born with a lot of money, and those that are born with a lot of money can use a lot of money to gradually replace laborers with automation and industrial technology. And that's what they saw in Europe at this stage. But people who have labor only, their labor reduces over time. So it doesn't get more, it becomes less. You grow older and older and less able to work and be very productive. And so gradually you die. You don't get more hours to sell to people over time. And when you are born, you don't inherit a lot of time to start with. You don't inherit labor that gets more and more as time goes by. Your labor gets less and less. And so basically what they realized is that there is an inequality between those who have labor and those who have capital, with those who have capital being richer and richer, whereas those with labor only gets poorer and poorer, especially because capital is then incentivized to replace production with more machinery, right? And so the more machinery they have, the less labor they need. And so then laborers become more and more unemployed. Okay, so that's really what they saw. And they, Marx typified society based on three classes. So he spoke about the elites, who are the owners of capital. And then below the elites are what he called the bourgeoisie. And so if you, on TikTok and whatever, you might see some people are called very bougie. And bougie, that's what it comes from. It comes from this French word bourgeoisie, which is referring to the middle class. And so the way that Marx then said is that below that, is the owners of labor, what he called the proletariat. And so what Marx said is that the elites use the bourgeoisie to exploit the proletariat. But the bourgeoisie, because they are not the ultra rich, they actually end up perpetuating this system because they are specialists. So they are able to sell their skills for higher prices than the proletariat. Whereas the proletariat kind of just sell their skills in mines or on farms. And so they have very limited power to change the system. And what Marx said is that every revolution that comes is just basically the bourgeoisie swapping places with the elites. The proletariats always stay at the bottom of this pyramid and they never progress. So what he proposed, along with other thinkers like Lenin, was that the government should actually be only the proletariat, because the government is should be the majority of population. And the bottom of that pyramid is actually the majority of the entire pyramid. So what he was saying is that we should implement what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that we should take the people should implement a really strict form of direct democracy in order to overthrow the system, so that it is the people who decide what happens in government. And in that way, the capitalist system, which basically supply and demand decide how much everyone has, should be instead overthrown, and it should be the people that decide how much everyone should have. Okay, so if you can follow the logic, basically what he was saying is that in the feudal system, we had kings and queens deciding who gets what. That didn't work because it was just one king or one queen. Now we have the free market deciding who gets what. And that doesn't work because the free market is unequal and the rich end up getting everything. And they get more and more and the poor get less and less. So what he was saying is that let us overthrow this and go back to a system where it is the majority that decides who gets what. And in that way, everyone is able to get what they want because they all decide what it is that people should be getting. Okay. And so the government should actively combat the forces of self-interest to arrive at optimal resource allocation. Now, what's important to note is that there was and I just want to throw this in there, there was a very important thinker at the time, Mikhail Bakunin, who he was very much in support of this idea and the problems associated with capitalism. But he said that we cannot have the dictatorship of the proletariat. We cannot overthrow the government and install a people's government, because he said, and he said this in the early 1900s, he said that we will just get a new version of elites that just pretend to be of the people, that pretend to be poor, but in fact, they are just new elites. And so this system will not change. We will still have the proletariat, even if we have a dictatorship of the proletariat. But Marx and Lenin didn't agree with him, and they went forth and they did a lot of, they instigated and led a lot of revolutions. Lenin led the revolution in Russia, and the result, unfortunately, was that Bakunin's prophecy came true. And in Russia, an elite was just established of the proletariat, who then ruled the country without actually ever listening to what the proletariat wanted. But they were very sure to tell everyone how they were of the people. Okay, so this is basically Marxist Leninism and what they proposed government should be doing. Do you have any questions about this before we move on? Gugu says, where would Britain be classified since it still has a monarchy that has a form of government influence? Yes, so Britain is essentially, it is what is called a constitutional monarchy, which means that even though the monarch is the supreme leader of that country, the monarch's power is limited by a constitution, and they have a democratic system which votes in the new government. And so in essence, the Queen of England is really, the Queen of Britain is really just it's an honorary title. It's not really, doesn't really have that much influence and power. So it is, for all intents and purposes, a democracy. Okay. I just want to remind you guys that these are more ideologies than necessarily government systems. Leninism and Marxism is more a way of thinking. It is more a way of saying, what do we believe the government's role should be? So it's not a system, it's an idea, if that makes sense. Okay, China goes for any system that profits it, but makes them still look conservative, says Eche. So China is really predicated on this idea of Marxist-Leninism, which really believes that the government is the best thing to allocate resources. To some extent, they have allowed in the past 2 decades to be more open to market forces, but before that, and in many ways still today, they do believe that the government has a very active role to play in making sure that people have enough things, and that everyone is better off. They think it's the role of government to ensure that things are better off. Whereas comparing it with Britain, Britain thinks the government should not really be too involved in the economy. It should fairly much leave things alone, and things will sort of sort themselves out through the supply and demand. Okay. Any other questions before we move on? Yes, please.
I just want to clarify. So doesn't then Marxism kind of draw classes that, yeah, okay, classes, the 3 main classes that we see here, that usually something like if the government was allocating resources should try and fight. Because I think at the end of the day, when you try to say these people are these and these people are these, so we take resources from these people, give to these people, and then we take labor from these people and serve it and then they're put into categories. Isn't that what they were originally trying to go against, which is the growing inequalities? If again you serve people within their respective small, I don't know, boxes that you place them according to how able they are to get resources. I'm just a little bit like the contradiction here. I don't know if it's an actual contradiction or what I'm just imagining, but that was my thoughts.
Okay, I think it's good thoughts. Let me try to answer it and tell me if it's giving you a little bit of clarity. So what Marx observed, and we know this fairly certainly, that a pyramid like this is basically what capitalism produces. It produces an elite, it produces a bourgeoisie, and it produces a proletariat. All societies are structured in this sort of pyramid, right? But what capitalism or classical capitalism says is that there's no problem with this pyramid because a level of inequality is part of nature, is what capitalist thought would tell us. And so the fact that someone in the proletariat can see someone in the bourgeoisie and someone in the bourgeoisie can see someone in the elites means that people are incentivized to work harder. And because of the market being free, technically, it is possible for someone from the proletariat to improve their lives and move into a different social class, right? And that's kind of the theory. So they think there's nothing wrong with this pyramid. The Marxists, on the other hand, say that the pyramid is very rigid. And it is actually, even though theoretically it's possible to move and work hard and work yourself out of poverty, in truth, it is not. In truth, the system just pushes the proletariat down even more and the elites higher even more. And the bourgeoisie is eventually starting to disappear more and more, so much so that it later doesn't exist anymore. That's what Marxists would tell us. And so they were saying that the only way for someone to be better off is not to work harder, but to destroy the entire system and to make everyone on the same level. That's what Marxists believe still in many ways. Yeah, does that make sense? So it's it's about trying to put everyone on the same footing, whereas capitalism says that no, there's nothing wrong with this pyramid, and it is just by working harder, everyone can be better off, and maybe the entire pyramid can rise and be in a better state of life. And Marxism said no, it is only the top of the pyramid that increases, and the bottom just gets pushed lower and lower through technology. Does this make sense, Belize? Is that kind of answering your question? Okay. Okay. Eche is reminding me of a very important point. How did this affect African revolution? Because most African revolutionaries were supposedly Marxist. So, very interesting point. What many Marxists in the 1900s realized, and for those, I think in GC, you might have had a little bit more exposure around the impact of the Cold War on the freedom struggle. But at the time in the 1900s, many Marxist thinkers realized the similarities between the African system and this class struggle, the Marxist class struggle. And what many revolutionaries, including Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere and Thomas Sankara, they all kind of said that in reality, it's not as much a struggle for freedom as it is a class struggle, right? The class struggle is synonymous with the freedom struggle, because the African in many ways was part of the proletariat in a much more rigid way than any white person of the proletariat in Europe was. Because a European proletariat could, at least at face value, look a little bit different and could gradually evolve into someone from the bourgeoisie. But because of racism and the colonial system, an African could never become that. And so in a way, the struggle for freedom was defined as being along these class lines as well, with the African being part of the proletariat and basically the entire Europe being part of the bourgeoisie, and then the elites being the same elites that has always ruled in Europe and parts of Asia. Okay, so that's why Marxism became a very big unifying factor, because it explained a lot of the struggles that people experienced in Africa. And that's why many governments went the Marxist-Leninist route to say that let's overthrow the government and let the government decide fully how the country should be run and who gets what. And unfortunately, as history showed us, that failed quite dramatically. Okay. It just says African bourgeoisie must commit a class suicide. Okay, very provocative. Okay, Nicholas says that all forms of economies might create classes, except if it's some sort of utopia. Yes, so that I think was kind of the point, is that what capitalist thinkers say is that classes are inevitable. We cannot change it. But what Marxist thinkers say is that the only reason why we think classes are so inevitable is because we have been told that they are inevitable. And so it is only us that keep making classes because that's what we are used to. And the moment that those classes cease to exist, we will also cease to need those classes. The only reason why we need classes is because we have created a system where our survival depends on how good we are at exploiting those around us. If we are a butcher or a baker, our success depends on how effectively we can exploit the other butcher or the other baker, okay? And so in that system is captured the seeds of class, and we cannot let go of classism without also letting go of our need to exploit other people. So that's essentially the thinkers. Whether or not you agree with one camp, that's up to you guys to decide. Okay, one thing that we can conclude from this is that both free market capitalism has its problems, as well as Marxist-Leninism. Both of them have their problems. Both of them saw massive failures, massive human issues the past 100 years. And so during the latest theory that came into existence is the idea of Keynesianism or institutionalism, right? And so in the 1930s, there was a big, what is called the Great Depression, which affected the United States and Europe. And it was basically an imploding of capitalism. In many ways, it was capitalism failing and causing a lot of bad things for a lot of people. Unemployment skyrocketed in the United States, poverty skyrocketed, and many people didn't even have enough money to eat. And so it was a really big problem, and it was a very big embarrassment to the United States, because at the time they were trying to prove to the entire world that free market capitalism is fantastic. And they were not really doing free market capitalism, but they were very close to it. And the result was that the economy imploded. And so John Maynard Keynes was an economist, British economist, who came up with this theory about how to manage economies better. And what he was saying is that governments do have a role to play. Governments should be involved in the economy, but their involvement should only be to regulate and influence markets indirectly. They should not directly decide how much food people have. They should indirectly try to influence the way that food is allocated in the economy. And so in that way, the government's role is just to create a stable environment, because in that stable setting, growth can happen. People can have better livelihoods, and then the market can sort things out itself, as long as the government is able to provide stability and able to regulate markets, okay? So government's role is to build institutions that cause favorable conditions for the market. And government should set rights and laws and regulations that cause good governments even when bad people are in power. That's essentially institutionalism, that countries are good when they have good institutions. And so the sole purpose of government is really just to create good institutions and to uphold those institutions, okay? And Keynesianism, institutionalism has become quite kind of the mainstream, the thing that most countries today are doing. Most countries advocate for regulation and market influence and trying to create stability instead of actively running the economy. But at the same time, people don't want to step away from it entirely. So that's kind of the last theory that we'll be discussing today, and the one that's most common. Okay. Isn't that based on Darwinism? The stronger will dominate the strong. I assume you are referring to the previous discussion. Yes, probably. Yes, so I think Darwinism and the idea of survival of the fittest it has really influenced both the Marxist-Leninist school of thought as well as a capitalist school of thought. Yeah, so in many ways, it depends on what you believe around us as a species. Are we inherently cooperative, or are we inherently competitive, or maybe both? We don't know. Depends on what you think our makeup as an animal is. Are we social animals? Are we competitive animals, or both? Okay. Any questions about institutionalism or Keynesianism? No questions. What are its limits, says Venance. Okay. So firstly, I may talk about Venance's question, what are its limits? Good question, thanks, I forgot to mention this. So the problem that we've seen with institutionalism and Keynesianism is that instability still happens, and we have not really figured out what are the right rules and the right regulations and the right institutions, because we can create a very good institution and then bad things still end up happening and causing a lot of instability. A good example being in the 2008 economic crisis, which affected the United States and Europe disproportionately. That was quite well regulated. Some say not well enough, and that's probably the reason why we can have better regulation. But the idea is that there's always better regulation, and so we are constantly discovering what is the next best thing. So if anything, this approach, the Keynesianist institutionalist approach, is very evolutionary in terms of it will improve over time. And sometimes we have failures, like, for example, Donald Trump overstaying his welcome in the White House. And then we need to figure out what changes do we need to make to the institution to ensure that something like that doesn't happen again. Or maybe the fact that he left is a testament to how good the institutions were. He left, he didn't stay. He attempted to cause a riot and attempted to cause a civil war, but it didn't happen, thankfully. So that is, if anything, a test to the strength of that institution. Okay. In terms of the limits as well, is that it's very difficult for us to say what rules and regulations are relevant everywhere, because sometimes a rule works in one country for one time, and then another time it doesn't work in that same country, or it works but not in that time. So, sorry, not in that country. So it's very fickle. It's very difficult to know what are the right institutions. Okay. Eche says there is an assumption that the institution will serve the people's interests. Yes. That's a very good point. And I think Alan's point about lobbying weakens institutionalism. That is a very good point, because still today we see a disproportionate influence of certain parts of the economy. And that's something that we want to illustrate in this game as well, the simulation on Fridays. You might have seen that some people, politicians, have a lot of influence. Business interests also have a lot of influence, maybe not in the past Fridays game, but in future games, you will see that business interests and international interests, they do have a disproportionate influence in what happens in the economy, what policies gets implemented, what things get funded or don't get funded. Okay, so the truth is that it's not perfect, and it still represents some narrow interests. Rolani says, does it imply that through government regulation and influence, the government knows what is best for the economy, similar to a planned economy? Yes, it does imply that. But the difference, I think, is that the government doesn't believe that it knows everything. It believes that it can influence things, but it doesn't believe that it knows everything. Whereas in a planned economy, the government assumes that it knows everything, and it can decide how much rice every person should have, up to that granular level. But in this institutionalistic economy, it doesn't assume that the government knows how much rice people should have. It just assumes that the government can dictate how people should work, in what conditions people should work, or how much tax people should pay, or where people need roads built. So it's much fewer things that the government needs to know. Does that make sense? Okay. But we see that the government is made of the elite, same as those that control the institutions. So the lower classes is still not being represented. That is a very valid point. And that's why I think most countries, if you compare them to a few 100 years ago, have a much larger representation of normal people. And also, if democracy works effectively, then the average person should have an influence into who is in power and who is in charge. Unfortunately, sometimes it is still the elites, but there is technically a possibility for that not to be the case. Stefan is asking, among these three theories, which have been used to successfully change the economy of a country? So like I said, these are ideas, and these ideas have inspired various methods of implementing economic policies. So it's very difficult to say which specific one, because most countries actually used all three theories to build parts of their economy. And so I think there are examples, an example of a country using a more open economy was perhaps the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, which both of them had very open trade policies, and they had very accommodating private property structures. So everyone could own anything, really. And as a result, the country did do a lot of trade and did develop quite well. Then we have countries that were very heavily involved in the development of their, the government was very heavily involved in the development, countries like the United States or Germany or France, where the government was really heavily involved in the development, and so Norway as well. And so they implemented a more mixed approach of institutionalism and Keynesianism. China is another example of using Marxist-Leninist theory to evolve and develop its country. It took absolute control of the economy and as a result developed quite well and was able to build a lot of value. But even China implemented some elements of free market capitalism fairly recently. Even America implemented some ideas of socialism and the government being very okay, cool. So I want us to just briefly talk about something that annoys me a lot. And this is when people use terms incorrectly. And so I hope that you guys, as people who have taken poverty to prosperity, would not use these terms incorrectly. And so I want to just ask that you not confuse terms like communism with socialism, right? So communism essentially means that it is an idea, a proposal of how the economy can work, where everything is shared communally, right? That means that everyone owns everything. Nothing is basically bought or sold by people, because everyone can have everything. So communism doesn't exist, and it only existed in a very few historical examples. It's not a very common thing at all. So generally when people talk about communism, they actually don't mean communism. They probably mean socialism. And socialism is where the factors of production are socially owned, which means that land and most resources are owned by society as a large. Society as a whole decides how resources are allocated, okay? So socialism is something like the government buying and providing in social needs, such as education or welfare, or it just says society equals government. Yes, if the government is a democratic government, then we can assume that society is the same as government. If it's not, then it depends. Then government is not necessarily the same as society. Okay. So communism is not the same as Marxism. Marxism has to do with the ideas of Karl Marx, but communism is an idea that he proposed, but it is not something that he invented. Communism existed in Africa before Europeans came, and so when Marx was saying what lovely thing communism would be, it existed long before him. So he didn't invent communism. And it's not the same as his ideas, okay? And similarly, capitalism is, like I explained before, a system where the factors of production are owned by individuals. So that means land and labor is owned by individuals. And that means that capitalism is not the same everywhere. or every time. And it's very difficult for us to say if capitalism is a bad thing or if it is a good thing, because it's very different in every economy. And so in some economies where capitalism or elements of capitalism exists, where people have free access to land, it's a very good thing. In other places, it's maybe not a very good thing. And so it's very difficult for us to say capitalism is good or bad, because it looks different everywhere. We can rather say that capitalism in Russia in 1814 was very bad because it created inequality. But to say that capitalism is bad also discounts the fact that it was very good maybe in the Netherlands or in Mali or wherever. We don't know. So it's much better for us to talk about capitalism in a specific setting instead of saying capitalism is evil always. Okay. Cool. So the last few minutes, I want to just talk briefly about the various tools of that government has. And this is going to be very high level. For IBT students, this might be a revision of things that you already know. For GC students, this might be new, but very superficial. So you might want to do some more research about this. In particular, you guys will find a reading on a video on this for this week's required readings by Crash Course. And they explain what is fiscal policy and what is monetary policy. So what I'm going to be doing now is just a very brief introduction about what these things are and how they work in the economy. Okay, and the reason why I want to do this is I want you guys to think about yourselves in the scenario on Friday. So on Friday, you're going to be receiving some event, something is going to happen, and you will have the opportunity to use tools for government intervention. Okay, so and I want you to think about the implications of that tool that you will be using. If you choose to use taxation, what would be the effect of that on the rest of the economy? If you choose to use debt, what will be the effect of that on the rest of the economy? Okay, so let's quickly talk about one of the ways that governments get money, and then we'll talk about the ways in which government spends money. So the first way that it can get money, and the most important way, is through taxation. And you guys all know what tax is, I guess. If you don't, then you'll discover once you start working. But one way that the government can fund itself is through taxation. The other way is through debt. Now, I'm not going to talk about debt in detail today. I think you guys understand basically what is debt. But taxation is very important because it can influence the rate at which people save and spend. If people need to suddenly pay more tax, they are less likely to spend money. Okay, and someone from my class last year, can you please just remind us what happens if people spend less in the economy? What are the knock-on effects of people spending less? Let's assume government increases tax rates. What happens?
Can I try?
Yes, please, Alan.
Yeah, so if the tax rates do increase, people save more money. And if they save more money, they're more likely to invest that money into, let's say, some other projects or in other sectors of government, or let's say in the private sector. And after that, they are also able to incur income, and at the end of the day, they are able to become more wealthy because they're able to accumulate wealth.
Because they're saving.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good point. So if taxes go down, people might be more likely to save that money instead. And that saving then can be reinvested in the economy and cause people to be better off. Yeah, very good point.
I have a
Thanks,
question.
Alan. Yes, please.
So just another scenario out of the blue. If people don't spend their money and save, well, it means that people who are saving actually have that money, and probably if money is not going around, then those who own that capital will, like, it will saturate into one place, and then it won't be good for any other class minus the one that already has the money and has the ability to save. because of course you can't save unless you have satisfied your basic, or say your priority needs. So it's more like the ones who had more has now abundance, and like money is saturated into one, I don't know, space.
Yes, that's a very excellent point. Yeah. So I think it is important there for us to understand what happens when taxes decrease. So let's say people pay less tax. Does that mean they will save more, or they will spend more because they now have extra money, right? Because taxes went down. Will they save more or will they spend more? And the answer differs from country to country, from time to time. Sometimes people save that money, sometimes they spend that money, and that changes from country to country. So let's assume now, and I want to ask if you can follow Belisa's train of thought. What happens if people spend less in the economy? Additional, do you want to answer that?
No, I just wanted to add on to the previous question on when, like, the scenario of when people are saving more, and like when people like potentially would not want to spend in this case, like just trying to add your question to it. I think then that's where economic policies come in, because and how central banks now sort of like force, I won't say or enforce banks to have certain savings rates or like interest rates, so that they can now convince the populace to start, just try to have this capital flow into the economy back. So I think that's where a lot of policy comes in with regards to how to increase people's spending power, because I know like Central Bank of Nigeria currently, and that's why there's a lot of fintech solutions arising in Nigeria, because of they're trying to promote fintech penetration in Nigeria. So there's a lot of licensing, although it's not easy because there are a lot of startups that want to jump into it, but there's a lot of licensing for non-commercial banks, and more of startups. So I think it's much more about the incentives, government incentives and policies.
Yes, you're very right. So that's why the amount of people that will save instead of spend really depends on so many factors, and the government can influence those. But what also often happens, and this is something that might be a little bit of a paradox, right? We might think that if the government charges more tax, the government gets more money. But the reality is sometimes it can have the opposite effect, because what can happen is that the government charges more tax, right? And people, as a result of needing to pay more tax, they buy less products, right? So they consume less. And because they consume less, businesses don't sell as much. And because they don't sell as much, their income goes down. Because their income goes down, they don't pay as much tax, because they pay tax based on their income, right? So as a result, or people relocate, says Adishna. So as a result, we can actually cause less income to the government by charging higher tax rates. Does this make sense? It's a little bit strange to think that if the government asks more tax, it can actually get less money in the end of the day. So the governments really need to be very careful when they increase tax rates, because it can cause them to actually have less money in the end of the day. Okay. So I just wanted to mention that taxes can be regressive or progressive. Regressive means that poor people generally pay more proportionately, and so it doesn't redistribute income. Whereas an example of that being value-added tax, which the poor disproportionately pay more of because they buy more value-added tax produce, whereas the rich don't pay that much because most of their money goes towards investments and savings, which is you don't pay value-added tax on that. However, you do get progressive tax systems, such as pay-as-you-earn, where the more you earn, the more you pay. And so in that way, this tax system takes from the rich and kind of redistributes it to government. And the government can then use that, hopefully, to improve the lives of the poor. And in that way, it can correct inequalities. Okay. Okay, so when it comes to spending money, we know that the government generally can have either a neutral, a positive, or a negative impact in spending money. And so by taxing people and by taking out loans and whatever, the government eventually creates what is called a fiscus, or a treasury in some countries, right? And so all of that money that the government has is called the treasury, the national treasury, or the fiscus. And the government can spend that money as a government on whatever it wants to do, right? If it spends that money on maybe government officials or politicians, it has a fairly neutral effect on the economy. Because, as you can see in this graph here on the left, the government taxes normal people and takes, let's say, $100 from them in tax. It takes that $100 in tax and it goes to the fiscus, that $100. That $100 then gets spent on people's salaries. Those $100 of salaries then get spent on goods in the economy, buying produce and food and whatever from normal people. Normal people then get that $100 back, and then they get taxed that $100 again. And so it's a circle that doesn't really make the world a better place. However, what government can do is they can spend it on things that are much better than just the one-time amount of money input. Example of this is infrastructure. If they spend, they tax $100 from a bunch of people, it goes into the fiscus, and then they build a bridge for $100, and that $100 that is used to buy the bridge gets back to the builders of the bridge. So in that way, the money stays in the economy. But now many people are able to create new businesses, maybe crossing that bridge. There's new trade links that can form, and so new businesses can develop, and those businesses are much more able to make more money than just the $100 that was initially invested in that bridge. And so in that way, the government is able to create a net positive effect on the economy. The last option is that the government can spend its money on imported luxury goods that mean that the money flows out of the economy. So the government takes that $100 from the people, but instead buys imported Brazilian, Belgian, German cars like Mercedes-Benz, for example. And those cars, that $100 then goes outside of the economy into another country. And so it doesn't go back into the economy and creates value or keeps the value inside the economy. So in that way, some people are very critical of government spending, but government spending can be good or bad, depending on what the government chooses to spend the money on. Sometimes they can build a bridge that goes to nowhere and doesn't produce any value. And sometimes they build a bridge that causes a lot of value. It's very difficult for governments to know, but governments can have a good or a neutral or a negative effect by spending money. And the act of spending money is what we call fiscal policy. By buying or constructing infrastructure, or by paying people salaries, including the police, including the education sector, giving resources and grants. That is all what we call fiscal policy, government spending. Okay. Any questions about this before we move on to the last section? We're running out of time, so I'm just going to take one question.
So I have a question.
Sure, Peter.
When you said of the government buying these cars, you didn't explain where, like, what the cars are going to be used. Maybe they are going to be used in something like which is going to profit the community. Is that it's going to be like that bridge?
Good point. It can be. But if it is the minister's very fancy Maserati that he drives around in, it's not going to cause a lot of benefit for the economy as a whole. Or if it is the minister's wife who is now able to go and have very luxurious shopping trips in Paris, then that is a problem. Now, specifically, you guys might know I'm referring to Google's country, whose first lady was very much known for taking millions of dollars to spend it in Paris. So yeah, that doesn't cause a lot of value in the economy. Okay, sorry Google, I'm bashing, but you know I always like bashing my neighbor country. Okay, cool. So let's move to the next thing, and this is monetary policy. And when we talk about monetary policy, we are referring to policies implemented by the Reserve Bank of a country, or in some countries it's called the National Bank or the Federal Reserve, or in Rwanda it's called the Banque Nationale de Rwanda, and it's called something else in most countries, but it's called the Central Bank, the Reserve Bank, the National Bank, but basically the bank or the institution that prints and creates the money, the actual money of that country. And so they have the ability to influence the supply of money in an economy, okay? And so what they can do is they can increase the supply, and you guys do know supply and demand, right? So if they increase the supply, the relative value of that currency goes what? If the supply goes up, what happens to the relative value of that currency?
It goes down.
It goes down, yes, exactly. It decreases, yes, Belize. And if they decrease the supply, then obviously the value of the currency can increase, okay? And so they have generally two ways in which they can influence the supply of money. They can't really influence the demand of money because the economy is much bigger than their ability to influence the demand. They can just influence the supply. So the two ways in which they can influence the supply is firstly by using the central bank rate or the repo rate. And that is basically the rate at which normal banks buy money from the central bank, okay? So if they increase the rate, so they make it more expensive to buy money, then people are less likely to buy money from the central bank. And so the supply of money decreases, okay? If they make it very cheap to buy money from them, then people are more likely to take out loans. And so the supply of money goes up. Okay, the other thing that they can use is the sale and purchase of bonds, right? And so what they can do is to buy money from people in the economy by giving them a bond. So what that means, a bond is basically a IOU. It basically says that I will give you this money back in 5 years or 10 years time with some interest. But what that means is that if I sell a bond for 5 million to Alan, Alan doesn't have that 5 million anymore. He's given that 5 million to me. He's invested it in a bond with me. And so he knows that in a certain amount of time, I will give him that 5 million back. But for the next 5 years, he doesn't have that 5 million. So that 5 million cannot circulate in the economy. It cannot, it is basically taken out of the supply of the economy, okay? And so that's how they can manage the supply and demand of money, just the supply, sorry, not the demand. Okay, any questions about that? How does Alan benefit from that transaction? So Alan gets his 5 million back plus interest. And it's a very safe investment because Alan knows that I actually print money. So Alan will definitely get his money back. So it's a very safe investment and he gets some interest back on that. Yeah, so he doesn't incur any losses. That's how he benefits.
Quick question.
Yes.
how about like for example, a central bank in Rwanda, or I don't know, maybe in Francophone West Africa, how about those who don't print their own money? Or I mean, of course, Rwanda is very different from the Francophone West Africa. We don't print money point blank, but I think West Africa has a little bit more complex situation going on. But how much of this can our banks do? Like, how much control do we have if you can't print money and we have to ask other people to print money, and then it comes into things like regulations from whoever prints our money?
Yeah,
Which I think is it the World Bank, something like that?
No, so in the case of West Africa, or it is actually France that is in charge of monetary policy. And that's the thing, because they are not able to produce their own money, they cannot actually have monetary policy at all. So they are not able to, they only have one tool, which is fiscal policy. They can't use monetary policy as a tool. And so if you guys have been looking at the news, you would notice that there's a lot of, yes, Francophone West Africa. Thank you for that correction, Eche. What is happening in the news is that there's a big push to create what is the ECHO, which is a single currency that will be used in West Africa, including Anglophone West Africa, if everything goes to plan. But basically to free these countries from being controlled by European powers for their monetary policy. And the original reason why France didn't give them the power to print their money is, and this is true in the documents, they said that we don't think African states have the ability to do monetary policy, so we will do it for them because they don't know how. So yes, it was a very racist attitude, and it's very strange that it still persists to this day. What benefits do Francophone African states have from that? So they have the perceived benefit of stability. And because the idea is that France is better able to manage their monetary policy, and so then they don't have to. And also the elected officials in those countries cannot take charge of monetary policy like they have in some countries on the African continent, where the elected, or the government just kind of printed more money to pay for any fiscal policies that they wanted, and the result was skyrocketing inflation. And so that didn't really happen in West Africa, which typically saw low inflation rates. But the idea is they don't have the ability to make their own economic decisions. Okay. Belize says their currency is linked to that of France. Yes, it is linked to the currency of France. And so that kind of really beautifully dovetails us into this last graph. And given the time, I am going to attempt it in a very few seconds. But basically, monetary policy is exceptionally difficult, much more so than fiscal policy. Because with fiscal policy, the only problem you have is that you can actually build a bridge that leads nowhere. And so you have a bad impact on the economy, a somewhat bad impact on the economy. But if you have a very good, meaning politician that builds a bridge instead of buying a Maserati, then in general, it's very difficult for you to have a negative impact if you're a good politician with fiscal policy. But when it comes to monetary policy, it's very easy to screw things up, even if you are a very good politician, because monetary policy is very complex and it relies on balancing various aspects of an economy. And so when it comes to monetary policy, there are three considerations that the government should always consider. And within economics theory, it's basically called the impossible policy trilemma, because you cannot have all three of these objectives. You can never achieve all three of these objectives. So, for example, on this triangle, we have at the top free capital mobility. What that means is that your currency is freely traded. Anyone can buy and sell that currency, right? And so if you want that, if you want people to freely be able to invest in your country, That is one objective. And it's a good thing if you want free capital mobility, because what that means is that investors can very easily go to Francophone West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire, and say, we want to invest in this business, and they can easily put their money and buy any currency and invest, right? So you want free capital mobility. You also want exchange rate management. You also want to somehow be able to influence your currency so that it's not incredibly unstable and doesn't fluctuate dramatically from day to day. Because if you have too erratic and too unstable foreign exchange, it becomes very difficult to do business. If today you can get $1 buys you 900 francs, and tomorrow $1 buys you 2,000 francs, and the day after that $1 buys you 5 francs, it becomes very difficult to price anything that you import from the United States, because the price changes all the time, right? And so you want a level of exchange rate stability in the economy, right? And you want to be able to manage your exchange rate. Finally, you also want to be able to do monetary policy freely, but you cannot do all three of these things at the same time. And so you as a country need to choose which one of these are you going to sacrifice. In the case of Francophone West Africa, they had to sacrifice monetary autonomy. And so they have free capital mobility, and they do have a very stable foreign exchange, but they cannot decide what they do with their monetary policy. In the case of South Africa, we have free capital mobility and we have monetary autonomy, but we do not have exchange rate management. And so the rand is constantly fluctuating all the time based on supply and demand of currency. In the case of China, for example, and also Ethiopia to some extent, they have exchange rate management and monetary autonomy, but they do not have free capital mobility. People cannot easily bring in money and just easily invest. There's a very specific process, and the government limits certain investments at certain times to manage the exchange rate and the monetary autonomy. Okay, so that's kind of it for today. And I'm sorry I'm taking 5 minutes more than I should have. And if you have more interest in this policy trilemma, I would encourage you to go and watch some videos on that. I'm pretty sure you'll find something on YouTube or read up some of the articles. In particular, there's a very interesting case study of this trilemma, where it was first kind of observed during the Asian debt crisis. And so then for the first time in the 1990s, people realized that you can't have all three at the same time. Okay. So for Friday, I want you guys to think, if you were a government, what policy tool would you choose to make changes to your country? And what are the ramifications of choosing that tool? If you choose fiscal policy, what are the potential implications of that? If you choose monetary policy, what might that do to the rest of the economy? Okay, so think about that, and we will see you all on Friday. And like I said, please look out tomorrow for the office hours information to be shared on Canvas, so that you can book office hours for your various interest groups. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. And again, apologies for taking a little bit longer. Hope you have a fantastic evening, and hope you eat well. I'm going to eat now. I'm so hungry.
Yeah. Hi, Rudy.
Yes,
before you leave, please.
Yeah.
I would really like to recommend that this type of sessions be uploaded on YouTube rather than on Canvas. Like, putting a link is way better, because we don't always access those videos. I mean, for like just the reference purposes, because I've been in the class, but like just for reference purposes, it's easier to like upload it on YouTube than just Canvas.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. Cool. Thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic week. See you. Bye.